So for my interest, a class exemption, do you have to apply to benefit from it, or it's just automatically?
It's automatic.
If you meet the criteria.
So that's the benefit of this is that we do a little bit of hard work now to write that class exemption, get a lot of buy-in and feedback from industry. So I think Roadnight Taylor will be publishing some of the details of that on LinkedIn, so that people can just sort of see what the wording would look like, get as much feedback as possible, and then once that class exemption is written, it's a kind of fit and forget process. Everyone they take their own view as to whether or not they legally fall under the criteria of that class exemption. If they do, they don't need a licence. And there's no requirement for Ofgem to kind of adjudicate or for DESNOs to assess anything on an ongoing basis.
Welcome to the Connectology podcast. I'm Hugh Taylor, CEO here at Roadnight Taylor, and in these episodes, our grid connection specialists, the Connectologists, dive into the evolving grid connections landscape, often taking expert guests with them in order to discover, generate, and share insights that might just help you and maybe even industry as a whole to connect projects faster, at lower risk, and at lower cost.
Hello and welcome to another podcast from Roadnight Taylor. I'm Pete Aston and I'm joined by my colleagues Alex Ikonic and Catherine Cleary, and we're here to talk about Ofgem's call for input, which is called the call for input for sort of demand connections reform. This call for input's got three strands. It's got the curate strand, which is looking at the queue. It's got the plan strand, which is sort of around prioritisation of projects, and then it's got this connect strand, which is around ownership of transmission assets, which is what we really want to talk about today. So does one of you two want to sort of talk through what the problem is at the moment?
Yeah, I guess we've currently got a situation where demand and generation are treated quite differently in terms of what kinds of high voltage transmission assets they can own. So if you're a demand customer, particularly in England and Wales, then because there is, I think we'd say, ambiguity around whether or not you are allowed legally to own a transmission voltage asset, so a 400 kV cable or a transformer, for example, the TO would say, we'll give you a 132 kV point of connection, so a distribution voltage point of connection in England and Wales. So a data centre, would typically be given a 132 kV, a couple of 132 kV bays at a new substation, whereas a generator applying for the same capacity in the same area might have just been given a 400 kV bay. So there's a disparity, and it's something which a lot of demand customers have really struggled with because it sort of perhaps constricts the engineering choices that they have. You might be a gigawatt data centre and having to cable back to that substation at 132 kV. And so there's a lot of appetite for this to change to sort of align the generation and demand ownership boundaries.
Okay, and is it a problem just for demand projects, or do generation projects get caught up in this at all?
So generation projects also get caught up in this, in particular when it's a kind of what we might describe as an energy park. So where you've got perhaps a single connection agreement with NESO, but you've got multiple types of generators that sit underneath it, or maybe just multiple generators which are going to be owned by a different entity. And then typically you'd have a sort of a grid co, so owning some shared assets, perhaps that transformer, and suddenly that grid co is now potentially needing a transmission licence because they're not a licensed entity like the generators. So they're potentially also in this ambiguous phase. So I think that the reforms for demand could really help those sort of mixed hybrid projects which are coming forwards.
Okay, makes sense. And Alex, just briefly, what sort of is this ambiguity? Not asking you to read chapter and verse from the Electricity Act, but what is the sort of issue that we're finding?
So there is this one phrase in the Electricity Act that refers to assets which are wholly or mainly transmission assets. So I think it's not very clear whether that means to do with the system, or is it sort of per asset basis, so a transformer versus a cable, or kind of the whole system. So I think there's a lot of discrepancies between how different TOs are kind of viewing that. And I think Ofgem might be able to provide a bit more clarity onto what's their legal interpretation of that. And I think that would really kind of clear things up for demand users, but also for these energy park projects as well.
So the Electricity Act says you need you need a transmission license if you're network.
If you're transmitting power over
yeah.
assets which are wholly or mainly transmission, and then there's a separate clause which is a carve out which says effectively unless you are another kind of licensed provider, like a licensed generator, and the assets we're talking about are those which connect you for the purpose of undertaking your primary license function. So if you're a really simple single generator, then actually the market considers there to be no ambiguity. You can own that 400 kV cable or that transformer, because that's just part of your generation license capabilities. But it's when we end up with an entity which isn't licensed, that isn't a generation license holder, that needs to own that asset, either because it's a grid co or because it's a demand user.
Yeah, and so I guess developers at the moment and investors are reluctant to take the risk and go, I'm going to own this 400 to 132 kV transformer and cross my fingers and hope that I've interpreted the Electricity Act properly.
Yeah, well, I think it could be really difficult from a kind of a legal perspective. So if you go and we've seen legal firms, very prestigious legal firms, give this advice to customers to basically say there isn't sufficient clarity to give you confidence you can own that asset. So they will always flag a risk. But I think it's even more fundamental than that, isn't it? If you were a demand customer at the moment and you apply, you're not going to even be given that choice. If in England and Wales, NGET are going to say, right, you're a demand customer. Our policy is we will connect you at 132 kV.
Yeah. So within Ofgem's demand connections reform call for inputs, they sort of flagged a few options, and we're going to talk through one particular one today. But just very quickly, what are some of the options that are being sort of highlighted that could be taken forward to help with some of this?
Thank you for listening so far. If insights like these are valuable in your work, then feel free to subscribe and stay current as Britain's connections landscape continues to evolve. Now, back to the connectologists.
So I guess the kind of first option is bringing in this idea of a demand license. So similar how we have the generation license, we could create one for demand users only. That doesn't really solve the problem that we're seeing with energy parks. The second one would be having a sort of independent transmission owner license. So similarly, we have IDNOs. We could create a license for transmission owners or operators to kind of own those assets. Then we could also kind of request that, particularly in England and Wales, that NGET build out two customer sites. So that could remove that problem of those long 132 kV cables. I think there might have been a fourth.
Oh, the fourth one was around self-build, which possibly doesn't actually solve this problem at all. But it's interesting maybe for different reasons. But that's basically saying, the design remains the same, the ownership boundary remains the same, but can the user build some of those TO assets and then hand them back over to the TO?
And I guess users and developers are going, maybe I can do it quicker than NGET can do it, and I'm going to speed the process up. Whether that's true or not, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's really kind of key to highlight there is that a lot of the reasons that developers have lots of appetite for this is because it's not just that they want to procure the same transformer that NGET would have procured. It's because they want to design something which inherently has perhaps maybe like less redundancy than the kind of the SQSS compliant the network that the TO has to design, or they want to change the design and kind of have more flexibility. And I think that self-build option doesn't allow that, because you're handing it back to the TO, so you've got to build it to their standards. So really you're just saying, these are both going to be apples, who can build this apple faster? It's probably a bit of a pointless question.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll come on to the fifth option, which we really want to talk about. So Jude, I know you've been sort of leading on this.
Yeah, so Roadnight Taylor have actually sort of drafted a specific proposal which would look at this aligning generation and demand kind of ownership boundaries. And the way that we think could be quite a neat solution to do that is to come up with a class exemption. So rather than coming up with new licenses, which are quite arduous, so the process for going through a kind of license application, is not straightforward, and it places obligations on both parties. So a class exemption, I mean, we already have really good successful class exemptions, things like small generators. So if you're a generator under 100 megawatts, there's a simple class exemption, which is written into kind of an appendix of the Electricity Act that says you don't need a license because you meet the following criteria. You're less than 100 megawatts, tick. So we're sort of proposing that we could add a class exemption to the transmission license, which would say, actually, for sole use assets, so if you're a single customer coming along, so a single connection agreement with NESO, and you want to build some sole use assets which don't interconnect with the rest of the transmission system, they simply supply your site. So that could be one data centre, it could be a one data centre and generator hybrid, or it could be an energy park, then you are exempt from the requirement for a transmission licence. And the benefit of transmission exemptions, as opposed to, a class exemption, is that the alternative is that the industry we see individual projects having to apply for a sort of site-specific, project-specific exemption.
There's not a lot of certainty with that either.
And
so.
I think you're involved in doing one at the moment. Is that right, Alex? Or
yes.
talking about it. And what's the sort of process you have to go through?
So there isn't really a set process. So it's a very kind of bespoke application. There's no statutory timelines, and there's no certainty that we will get it for this project that we're working on. So I think something like a class exemption is a very neat way to solve that problem.
And it's an application to the Secretary of State, effectively.
Yes, yeah. So that if you're making a site, if there's no class exemption and you're making a site-specific or project-specific exemption request, it's going to the Secretary of State. And DESNZ are busy, right? They don't have a team set aside waiting to kind of review all of these transition exemption requests. So
and so for my interest, a class exemption, do you have to apply to benefit from it, or it's just automatically
it's
applied
automatic
if you meet the criteria?
So that's the benefit of this, is that we do a little bit of hard work now to write that class exemption, get a lot of buy-in and feedback from industry. So I think Roadnight Taylor will be publishing some of the details of that on LinkedIn, so that people can just sort of see what the wording would look like, get as much feedback as possible, and then once that class exemption is written, it's a kind of fit and forget process. Everyone simply, they take their own view as to whether or not they legally fall under the criteria of that class exemption. If they do, they don't need a licence. And there's no requirement for Ofgem to kind of adjudicate or for DESNZ to assess anything on an ongoing basis.
And how easy is it to get a class exemption added into the regs?
So we have added a class exemption for transmission a couple of years ago. So there is one class exemption for transmission, which is 1 through 2 kV circuits offshore for offshore wind farms. Array cabling circuits are now exempt. And that took about, roughly speaking, about 12 months to get it into legislation.
Okay, so whichever option is going to be used, it's going to be after the implementation of Gate 2 to the whole queue.
Probably, yes, which definitely needs a bit more thought in the industry, because I think, projects or demand and energy park projects that are going through the Gate 2 to whole queue process now, how can they benefit from this? Because if we ask them to kind of wait for the next window and, apply for a MODAP, there's a big question about, will they be able to keep their queue position, or will they actually be put to the back of the queue because that's a major change to their connection? But also, we can't really ask the TOs to kind of implement these solutions now when there isn't any clarity on, whether that is allowed or, kind of ahead of the class exemption as well.
I think one thing so there are some groups which Ofgem and Ofgem and DESNZ in some cases have sort of set up to try and sort of work through these. We've got a Connect, Task and Finish group, which is sort of going to run for another 4 months or so. I think one really positive thing is that if there is quite a lot of industry agreement that this is a good solution, then we might be able to get to a point where actually the secondary legislation still has to go through process, but we have kind of very clear guidance that this is the intended route. And it might be that that's sufficient to give, it would need to be sufficient to give both TOs confidence that they were issuing offers on the right basis and developers confidence that they were kind of progressing their projects, using the right ownership assumptions. But that feels like it could be possible, so sort of if we were talking about midway through this year, end of June, and we had a bit of industry agreement that actually this was the solution we wanted to implement, I suspect quite a few people on the developer side will probably be happy to kind of take that risk and say, right, well, we know the legislation won't be in until next year, but we've now got the certainty we need as to what the direction of travel is.
Yeah.
And I guess maybe it could impact those phase 1 projects a bit less, which, practically speaking might be okay because they're probably a bit more progressed in the kind of the build out of those assets. So changing things now probably wouldn't be very beneficial for them anyway.
Yeah, I think I really agree with that. There seems like a pragmatic, just like going back to the Gate 2 point, which I think is a massive thing. If we are going to change this and it's a good solution that gives users more flexibility, I mean, if possible, we do want it to go into Gate 2 offers, but maybe it's more realistic for it to go into Gate 2 phase 2 offers, which are the kind of 2031 projects plus.
So what are the next steps for this? You talked about next 4 months or so being really important.
Yeah, so I think next 4 months will be really important. The next sort of week or so is actually really important. So Ofgem's call for input closes on the 13th of March, and we will do our best to try and get this podcast out before then. We'll definitely share some sort of pointers on LinkedIn before then as well. So I think we just encourage everyone to feed into that, especially if you do have an interest in this kind of HV ownership question, regardless of whether you're a generator or demand, feed into that demand call for input, I think, with, either support for this proposal or kind of, or concerns or feedback or alternative proposals.
And don't forget, in the call for input, there's also the curate and plan sections, and they're going to be really important about who's in the queue and who's out the queue. So I'm sitting on Ofgem's curate advisory group, or QRAG, as it's kicked off just yesterday, and you two are sort of on the task and finish group. So lots going, lots of sort of industry participation in these groups. But yeah, I guess the more responses to this call for input, the better, really, from different parts of the industry.
Yeah, I think whenever we're asking government to allocate resource to doing something, we need to make sure that there is a clear industry need to fix the problem. So I think, if no one replies, then we might all conclude that this isn't a problem and we can focus on other things. So we probably need people to reply.
Yeah, I think so. Anything else to say?
I think that's covered it very, very neatly, Pete.
Yeah, that's all.
Brilliant. Okay, in which case, thank you everyone for listening, and we just hope you join us for another podcast, and don't forget to reply to the call for input. Thank you and goodbye.
Thanks for joining the Connectologists in this exploration. This knowledge sharing is made possible by the support of our clients. We thank them and hope it will help the whole of industry to connect society's critical infrastructure faster. If you found this useful, you're welcome to explore more free insights at roadnighttaylor.co.uk/connectology, or click on the Insights tab at the top of our homepage.